Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Masters of TESOL. On this episode, intonation. Different languages around the world have different intonation patterns. Some are very fixed, and others, like English, are a lot more flexible and contextual. Russian and Japanese, for example, have a much narrower range of intonation than English, so to English ears they often sound flatter. And it's probably not surprising that women generally have a larger range than men. Our guest is Dorothy Chun, who has researched visualization for teaching intonation. Now, visualization is exactly what it sounds like. It's using a visual representation of intonation contours in order to show students the rises and falls of a particular utterance. So first, let's start with her origin story.
Okay. Well, this might actually be interesting for TESOL people because I am actually not a TESOL person per se. I'm Chinese American, born in Hawaii, but English was my first language. It was the only language I actually grew up speaking. Mm-hmm. And then my degrees are all in German. So right. I studied historical Germanic linguistics at UC Berkeley, and thought about switching over to major in Chinese because that's part of my heritage. But when they told me that it would take at least 10 years to do a PhD in Chinese, I decided to stay with German because, in fact, I had been studying German since I was in 9th grade. Okay. So I had become fluent in German and was able to be a teaching assistant as a graduate student, and so that's how I supported my PhD. But I actually wrote a dissertation about German, English, and Chinese. And, the book that I wrote on discourse intonation is not restricted to any one language in particular. I've presented at TESOL once or twice, but because much of what's in the book is about English, I think people assume that I'm in TESOL. In any case, I'm very, very interested in anything that has to do with intonation, whether it's in English or Chinese or German or any other language. And, since English is the lingua franca these days, it kind of makes sense to think about English, work on English, especially since, it happens to be my native language.
So I guess some people listening might be thinking that, intonation does vary so much between the varieties of English, then why is it even important?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Well, one of my sort of flippant first answers is that babies react first and foremost to intonation. Babies don't understand words. They just hear you saying, "Oh, you're just the cutest little thing." And they smile because that intonation is friendly and warm and happy. And then intonation is one of the last things that adults lose. So we all know, if we've ever tried to learn another language, that it's the intonation that marks us immediately as not being a native speaker. It's not so much the individual vowels and consonants, but it's the melody, rhythm of our speech that is so hard somehow to lose if we're trying to lose an accent. And now more and more research is also showing that when we think about and they used to call it foreign accent, when we think about accent or pronunciation, everybody has the native speaker as the goal. And number one, that's hard to achieve. But number two,
almost impossible, I guess.
Almost impossible. And number two, we're realizing through research that it's the so-called suprasegmentals that are what make language comprehensible and intelligible, not so much the vowels and consonants.
All right, so just for anybody listening who's not aware, could you explain what segmentals and suprasegmentals are, please?
Yes, so segmentals are basically, in really simple terms, vowels and consonants. Suprasegmentals are everything that is superimposed over these vowels and consonants. So you have rhythm and melody and stress and pause. All of these things are over and above the individual syllables that are composed of vowels and consonants.
some people would say that like you can't really teach intonation. There's such kind of cognitive load already with producing, you know, the function and the pronunciation elements, that actually teaching intonation is kind of overloading the students.
Mm-hmm. Well, my response to that is if you teach it as a whole, for example, with this idea of chunks, when you teach chunks, you insist that the students produce this phrase like, how are you doing? All together, right? As a chunk. Not how are you doing, but how are you doing? And if you insist, you know, when you're producing these chunks on good / comprehensible / intelligible intonation, I think maybe that's one of the first steps. That and another good analogy that I like to use is you remember things that are in songs, right? You remember songs, you remember words in songs. You can have something going around in your head over and over again. Let's say that you learned in childhood, and I think part of the reason you remember it is because of these suprasegmentals, right? The melody and the rhythm. And so if we could harness that kind of holistic approach to language, maybe that will make it more learnable and less overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'd read somewhere that there's a theory that because written language is fairly recent in human history, that
Yes.
a lot of information was passed on kind of in song form.
Yes.
So our brains
yes.
are kind of developed to remember songs better than remember somebody's speech, for example.
Exactly. Or something you've read, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Looking at the importance of intonation, then, can you tell us a little bit about some of the
Right.
research that you've done into different intonations and teaching intonation?
As I said, you know, one of the first things is actually being aware that it even exists, because in most textbooks that you'll look at, all they'll care about is, okay, well, here are the sounds that make up this language. Here are the vowels and here are the consonants. Obviously, when you're talking about tone languages like Chinese, which, you know, I'm familiar with, you do have to think about prosody in the sense of pitch contours, pitch height, pitch level, all of these things. But for most languages, people don't talk too much about intonation. You might see a few things in textbooks like, well, to ask a question, your voice must rise.
Mm-hmm.
To make a statement, your voice must fall. But these are just the most very basic kinds of intonational patterns. And as you say, the different dialects will have different kinds of falling and rising. It's not just a matter of everybody has the same kind of fall or the same kind of rise. Different dialects of the same language will have different kinds of falls and rises throughout sentences. And then you have the larger pieces like whole discourses. Research has shown that you know, at the beginning of a paragraph, a person's voice will start very, very high. And as you go on in the paragraph, ever so slightly, you know, the pitch of the voice goes down, so that when you're at the end of a thought or a paragraph, you're kind of at the lowest pitch of all. So one thing is to make people aware of what intonation is and why it's important. It's very complex. So I have spent many years trying to figure out what's important about intonation in different languages. What are the most important things about intonation to know about any given language? And obviously I don't have an answer yet. People write books about the intonational system of a given language. So one thing that I like to think about is, what are the functions of intonation in a language? And the easy ones are things like, how do you express surprise or anger or disgust? You know, because I'll take an example. You know, you can say a simple word like yes in many different ways. You can say yes, and means I'm excited, I agree. You can say yes, which kind of means, well, maybe. You can say, yes, I've told you that 1,000 times. And so even with a single word in English, like yes, you can pack so much information into it just with your intonation. So another example of how important it is and how we don't seem to talk too much about it. Ever since I wrote my dissertation and did what you did for your master's thesis, which was listening to recordings and trying to sort of map out by hand what the intonation was
You poor
doing,
woman.
I've always I've always wanted to have a computer do that for me. And so there are computer programs available. One of the most well-known is called PRAAT, P-R-A-A-T. And so my latest research has been with students learning Chinese, and we've used PRAAT to help them see the pitch curves that they make for when they pronounce words. We have them compare what they've produced with what the native speaker has done. And the hope is that by looking at these two different visualizations, they can figure out what's wrong with their pronunciation, correct it, and then improve their own pronunciation.
Yeah. So for anybody who's never seen this kind of software before, it kind of maps out sometimes in dots, but in a line sometimes, like
Yes.
the rises and falls, so you can actually
Exactly.
see what you've produced, and it's quite accurate, I think.
Oh, yes, yes, it's quite accurate. One of the big problems with this kind of technology and research is that computers can only map voiced sounds. So if you have a lot of voiceless consonants in your
Yeah, that's right.
sentences,
It's not so hot.
it's going to be very hard. You're going to get all these strange looking pitch curves because you've got a
Yeah.
lot of noise from the voiceless consonants. And so, we in our research, we've tried to pick words that have mostly sonorants, like vowels with M's and L's and sounds that the computer can actually hear and make sense of. And unfortunately, that's not always natural speech. You can't delete all the voiceless consonants from the words you use, or you can't, speak only in voiced sounds. So that's been one of the challenges of doing this kind of research with technology. But we're finding that this kind of training with using visualizations does seem to help learners of Chinese, at least, improve their tones. And I am hoping that this will be transferable to English, which is where intonation over a whole sentence or phrase is more important rather than just for individual words.
So if we think of like the traditional methods of teaching intonation, which was usually, I mean, some people have them waving their hands in the air, like going
Right.
up when it goes up. What advantages does the kind of digital approach have to this?
I think that it's the same advantages that a lot of other aspects of digital technology have, namely that a learner can do this in the privacy of his or her own home with earbuds, so that you're not necessarily in a language lab, but that you can practice as many times as you want. You can see the native speaker's version as many times as you want, and you can save all of the curves that you make and listen to them and try and figure out, okay, what did I say there? Why is it not rising? Or what did I say in this one that makes it look more like the native speakers? So I guess in a nutshell, one of the advantages of technology is that you have multiple modalities that you're addressing. So there's the visual, there's the audio, and when you can both hear and see what you've just said, hopefully that's an advantage to just, let's say, the old technology of recorders where it's just listen and repeat, and you just keep listening and repeating, but you don't get any kind of feedback. So the visual feedback that you get seeing your own pitch curve hopefully is going to also help improve if you can see and hear what you've just said and compare it to native speakers. Hopefully that will help.
Yes, because isn't it that especially low-level L2 speakers, that they tend to filter everything through L1, so they don't necessarily perceive changes that don't exist in their own language?
Exactly. Yes. It's like kids when you tell them, no, you said that wrong, and they'll repeat it and they said, but I said.
Yeah.
He's a language learner, right? You correct them and they said, oh, but that's what I just said. If you can show them, well, not exactly. You said this and it's supposed to be this.
So what were the results of your tests then using the visualization method?
So we did two different kinds of analyses. We had native speakers listening to the students and they rated them. And then we did acoustic analyses of what the students had produced, just to see how closely correlated the native speakers' ratings were. Here we're talking about comprehensibility or perception as opposed to acoustic evidence. And we were able to show that, the acoustic measurements don't lie, which we had kind of expected. But, we're also trying to tease out exactly what is more important. Is it pitch height? Is it pitch contour? And I think that acoustic measurements and visualizations can give us that kind of information, whereas simply our layperson's ears listening to things, we can say, oh, that sounds pretty good, or oh, that doesn't sound quite right. But the acoustics can be more precise about what it is that's a little bit off or not quite right.
So what were some of the biggest differences then between the native speakers' perception and the digital results or the analyzed results?
Native speakers actually have a difficult time pinpointing what the problem is.
So they know it's different, but
they know
sure
it's different.
why.
They know it's not exactly right, but they can't tell you, well, it's because you started too low and ended too high, or you didn't rise enough. Because in Chinese tones, for example, it has there's a falling tone. It has to be a sharply falling tone. Okay. And if it's not sharply falling, then it doesn't sound quite right. But the native speaker might not be able to tell you what it was. But if you look at the visualization, you can see, the learner's fall was kind of a more gradual fall, whereas the native speaker's fall was a sharp fall. So that was one of the things that, native speakers can't always pinpoint what it is. Pitch height is also relative, right? Because a male's pitch height will be much different from a female's.
Yes.
And a native speaker might not be able to tell you exactly where the problem lay. Did you not start this tone high enough, or did you start it too low, or whatever? And so I think that was one of the findings, that acoustic measurements are much more precise in pinpointing whether it's a pitch height or a pitch contour error.
Yes. I suppose one of the advantages, if the students are actually using it long term, that they can actually see their progress.
Yes, that's the hope. That's the hope. We have not done a longitudinal study yet to show how this might change over time, but that's on our list.
So you said you're actually developing you're developing an app to actually do this long term.
Yes. And so right now the app is for learning Chinese tones, but in the future I really want to expand that to languages such as English, where you might be able to have phrases or whole sentences that you look at the intonation of and try and help people get closer to the native speakers. But also we need to figure out the most important features to focus on. In other words, we talked about not necessarily striving for native-like pronunciation, but for comprehensible, intelligible speech, which I think Jennifer Jenkins talked about. We still need to figure out what the most important suprasegmentals are for any given language before we start teaching them and developing apps, for these most important things.
What is the classroom application? Like practically, what can teachers do using this information?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a much larger topic than people would realize, and maybe that's why it hasn't been addressed. One of the things that I think is becoming evident from research is that people learn things best in chunks. And so I think that when you're teaching in the classroom, it's nice to be able to focus on whole phrases and chunks rather than have people learn the individual words and try to put them together that way. And I think that works well for both if you're teaching grammar as well as if you're teaching pronunciation, because people don't speak in individual words. I mean, words are always elided together and said as phrases. And so I think one of the takeaways for comprehensible speech is to teach language in phrases and sentences rather than individual words. And when you teach phrases and sentences, you have a better chance of teaching the supersegmentals along with them, because you're not just stringing individual words together, but you're grouping them in thought groups. You have pauses between the phrases. And, that's sort of one of my first global kinds of recommendation. Another is when your students are just talking like this, you sort of make them aware that, language is all about being expressive and not sounding like a monotone. And again, it's this whole awareness of the importance of intonation.
Okay.
Something I used to try to do when I taught German was I said to my students, try speaking German like our good friend Arnold Schwarzenegger, where you're trying to imitate, because what's distinctive about his English is that he's speaking it with a German accent, right? So, take that accent, and it's all about the supersegmentals, and apply it to German, and maybe you'll be closer to a German speaker.
Was that successful?
Oh, they laughed, but I think, again, it's not that Arnold's vowels and consonants aren't right.
No.
And so, again, I know I'm speaking so generally and almost comically, but intonation is quite difficult to pinpoint. And if you can sort of look at it globally, I think that's kind of a more important thing right now than to say, okay, let's look at the falling and the rising and the, whatever else. But if you think more globally about what does, a good accent in this language sound like, maybe that will help people. And maybe that's one of the first things to think about.
So at the moment, is there any actual practical way to use visualization in a class?
So here's a funny story. I once was piloting or testing out a program called Tell Me More. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
No, I haven't heard of that one.
But that provided learners with the visualization of what they were saying. And so I had my students use it to learn German. And what the program did was it had you repeat a sentence, and then it would give you a score from 1 to 7 green bars. And if your pronunciation matched the native speakers, you'd get 7 bars. So my students were using this program, and I wanted them to look at the pitch curves, because this program actually showed you what the native speaker had said, a visualization of their pitch curve, and then a visualization of the learner's pitch curve. I was hoping that they would be comparing the two sets of pitch curves. But no, in fact, all they cared about was how many bars did I get? And so I said, okay, if that's all you're paying attention to, then we're going to have to do something different. And so what I did was I had them manually show the pitch curve of what they were saying and the pitch curve of what the native speaker was saying. And I was making them do this paper and pencil kind of activity.
Okay.
So they would pay attention to the pitch curve instead of looking at the bars. Okay. And so the funny part is that you have this wonderful technology, but the students are not paying attention to the right things. All to say that if you're going to try and use this with your students, having them view pitch curves, you have to make sure that they pay attention to them. Mm-hmm. And your activity has to be such that you say, well, how does your pitch curve compare to the native speakers, and what is different about it? And if they're not paying attention to the right things, then it's just going to be another boring activity. And so we as teachers have to somehow get our students to focus on the salient parts of the pitch curve. So one practical idea is to have them tell you what syllables are stressed in a sentence. What are the most important syllables in this sentence? And look to see what your pitch curve is doing. Have you accented that syllable both with pitch and with loudness, or with pitch and duration, as the native speakers have done?
Do you think it's enough to actually just show the curves and the contours? If they can just see it, would that be a useful thing in the class, or do they need to actually see their own production?
If they see in the pitch curve what is salient and what is important, that is the first step. And then if they can see what their own production is and compare it to what it should be, then that's kind of a second step. But there's sort of many steps here. I don't know if you've ever heard of jazz chants, but that was very popular in the 80s, so a long time ago. And it was, again, and I just looked it up online. If you look up jazz chants, I think .net or .org, that's another approach to sort of this music/rhythm-based approach to teaching English. But I'm thinking that it's still relevant, and any way that we can get learners to focus and remember is going to be to our advantage.
Okay, so Dorothy Chun, thank you very much.
Oh, you're most welcome. Good luck.
Excellent, thank you.
So there you go, something to think about and to use in your own classes. If you have any suggestions for topics, or even suggestions for people you want to hear interviewed, then please let me know at @MOTcast on Twitter, or you can go to the website, which is mastersoftesol.com, and let me know. So until next time, see you later.